We added our recipe model, now let's use it. So back to the recipe list component, here I added my recipes array, and now that we created the model, we can also define the type for this. So we can add colon to inform TypeScript that now we will define the type for this property. And the type will be recipe, so that will use our own model. And not just recipe, but an array of recipes, which is indicated by adding squared brackets after it. So now TypeScript knows the only thing which will ever get stored in this recipes property is an array which holds a couple of recipe objects, or also no such objects, that would be a possibility too, but certainly not a couple of strings or numbers, but objects like this, like defined in our model. Now, to inform TypeScript where this type is coming from, we need to add an import. So I'll import recipe. That is what we named it in here, right? That's our class name. So that's what we have to specify between the curly braces here. And now we have to move up one folder. Since we're in the recipe list folder right now, we have to go to the recipes folder because that is where our recipe model lives. So now I navigated up one folder, just like with the cd command in your terminal. And then it's in the recipe model file, again without the file extension. So with that we can now use this model, and now we can manage our array of recipes here. And let's start with one recipe, one dummy recipe. So in this array I will create a new recipe, and I can use the new keyword to create a new object based on this recipe blueprint, based on our class. And now when executing this like a method, we're actually calling the constructor. So now here, we need to pass the arguments we're expecting in this constructor. So name, description, and image path. Now you may choose any data you want here. I'll name this a test recipe. So that will be the title, the name of the recipe. Then the description. This is simply a test maybe. And the image path. Now, as I said, I'm going to use images from the web here. So we're going to use a URL. Now let's simply search for an image. And I will search for recipe. Let's use Google image search. I also want to make sure that I may use whatever I find here. So let's find a recipe, maybe this one here. Let's see if we take this. And deep linking like this, of course, should be done in a real app. This is just for testing this. So if we take this image here and paste the path in here as a string, now we should be able to use this later on once we output this. So with that, we are using our own model. We're using it here in the recipe list component. Of course, we won't be able to see anything for now. So to see that, we should actually do something in the template of the recipe list component. Here, I'm right now only outputting my recipe item. And I want to loop through all these items and use them to display my recipes. For now, what I will do is I will add a bootstrap row first of all, like that. And in that row, I want to add a column with the class colXS12 to have it span over the full width. And here, I will later add a button, or I will add the button right now, but I will later add the functionality to create a new recipe. So here, I'll simply set up a button with the classes button and then button success, where I say new recipe, like this. Now again, this will be hooked up later. So I'll add another row below this, which should now actually hold my list of recipes. Here I'll again use colXS12 to have to span over the full width. And keep in mind, this will already be nested inside of this MD5 column, so it's only that wide to begin with. But inside this column, I want it to span over the full width. And now here we will later output my recipe items. For now though, let's put the code we will later put into app recipe item into this component here directly. Because right now we will have no way of getting our recipe data down to the recipe item. So that is something I will actually do after the next section once we learned this. But so that we're able to see something, I will add the code for a single recipe item here into the recipe list directly. A single recipe item should be clickable. So it's going to be an anchor tag, because later once we click it, we want to select it. And here I will then actually assign another class which will be list group item to make it look like a list group item in Bootstrap. Also add clearfix, otherwise it will probably look wrong. And then I'll add a div which will receive the class pull left, since I want to have this on the left of this list item. In there, of h4 tag maybe with the recipe name. This should receive the class list group item heading. Again, these are all Bootstrap classes I'm using here. And there I will later output the name of the recipe, so recipe name for now. We will soon replace this with dynamic content. Below this, I want to have a paragraph with a class of list group item text. And here we will have the description of the recipe. And on the other side, I'll add a span with a class of pull right. In the span, I want to output my image. So here, what I'll do is I'll add a class image responsive so that Bootstrap will resize this image automatically for me. And again, all that content will go into the app recipe item component after the next course section. One more thing I want to set on the image though, I want to add my own style. I'll simply add an inline style here to set the maximum height of that item to 50 pixels so that we can't go above that, and Bootstrap will handle the rest and resize the image appropriately. So that's my setup for a single item. Of course, feel free to fine-tune this to your needs. Now with that, the goal is to replicate this item. Again, we will later put it into its own component and then fill these spaces here with dynamic data. This is your challenge. We got a recipe list component with our recipes array. The array only holds one item for now. You, of course, are free to add more. But even with that one item, you should be able to replicate this part here as often as needed to create one section of this code for each item in this recipe array, and then fill name, description, and the source attribute here, property, with the right values for this recipe. I will do this in the next lecture, but definitely try doing this on your own first. So were you successful using our recipes array here and replicating this part in the code as often as needed and fill it with the data for the recipe? Now clearly we need ng4 for this. So let's add ng4. This is the directive which allows us to repeat code in our template. And here I want to loop through all the recipes. So I will actually create a local variable named recipe. This name is totally up to you. That will simply store the recipe of each iteration in our loop. And I will loop through all the recipes. So through this recipes property we created here in the TypeScript file. Now with that, I'll also bring this into new lines here to make it a bit easier to read. With that, everywhere inside this ng4 loop, so everywhere here, we can use this recipe now. So let's use it to output the name. We can use string interpolation for that. String interpolation, as you learned, allows us to output some text anywhere in our template. Now we got this single recipe, but that's going to be an object looking like our model. Because remember, the recipes array simply holds an array of our recipes, so a single item simply looks like this. It has a name, a description, and the image path. Well, with this information, we can of course access the name here, like this. And for the description, we can replace this with recipe description. So we're going to use the property names we set up here in the model. And important, you have to use the ones here at the top, of course, because down there, these are only the constructor argument names. They are not available outside of this model. So that's the name and description. Now about that image. First of all, for that alt text, here, that's a normal HTML attribute, of course, I will use string interpolation to output some text here, the recipe name maybe. But regarding the image source itself, and I'm just splitting this over multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read. Regarding that source, we can follow two approaches. You can either use string interpolation here to output recipe image path here, and that should work fine. Or, as an alternative, you cannot use the attribute plus string interpolation, but you could bind to the source property itself. And now here you don't add curly braces, instead just recipe image path, because now we're using property binding and not string interpolation anymore. So here is a great example of where you may use both string interpolation with the normal HTML attribute, or not using the attribute but directly binding to the source property of the image, and then just putting in a valid expression returning what this property expects, in this case a string, between the quotation marks. Now I will go with the property binding approach here, and since I can't comment this out in here without breaking the element, I'm going to remove it, but I want you to keep in mind that both approaches would work. With that, let's save and see if we see something. And actually, that looks pretty good, but looks like the image I chose does not support deep linking. So that's nice, probably good for them. Let me quickly pick a different image then. So I ended up with picking this image here then. So you can see it here. And now we get the list working. This is the style I want to have. Of course, it doesn't do anything if I click it, but that's something we can add in the future. For now, the recipe list component is taking shape. I want to add one more thing though. I don't want to have this button sit directly on top of this list. So what I'll quickly do in my recipe list component here, between the button and the list, I can simply add a horizontal line to have a little bit of a, well, spacing in between and this nice separation. So that's the list, and you should see that if you add more items to that list, that it automatically grows. So if I simply duplicate this, because I'm lazy, you should see the same recipe twice here. So that's working great. Now let's work on the details section next.